listening to Climatic Scale, a podcast about what it really takes to scale climate solutions. My name is Aneri Pradhan, host and co-founder of Climatic Group, and I am joined today by a really exciting expert, Linda Zarai, who is the policy advisor, Clean Construction at Bologna Europe, and co-author of two key reports, EU-level impact assessment and policy options, transitioning to ZEMCON in European cities, and from Oslo to the EU, the journey towards clean construction. And our focus is to talk about a part of climate innovation that often gets overlooked, construction sites. They're a major source of emissions, noise, and air pollution in cities. But Oslo has been pioneering something called Zero-Emission Construction Sites. So I'm excited to have her give her insights onto how we can really reach net zero on construction sites. So for Linda, hi, welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me here.
Absolutely. So for our listeners who are new to this concept, what is a zero-emission construction site, or ZECS?
Okay, now take a construction site, conventional construction site that you might have in your city. In a zero-emission construction site, you will only see emission-free construction equipment or zero-emission transport vehicles operating. These are, for instance, like electric or hydrogen fuel equipment. The point is that you can't really have biofuel solutions. In that case, we're talking about fossil-free construction sites. And the key difference here is that in the case of zero-emission construction site, we don't have pipeline exhaust emissions, which also means that some key co-benefits materialize. We're talking about lower operating costs, we're talking about lower noise emissions, as well as improved working conditions and air pollution.
Interesting statistic I read from your report is that construction machinery and other non-road mobile machinery generate about 108 million tons of CO2 annually in Europe, making them a very significant but often overlooked emission source. But why should cities care about emissions from construction machinery in the first place when there are so many other areas in the urban environment to prioritize with decarbonization activities?
I think that at this stage, we shouldn't be looking at climate action through prioritization approaches. I think we're further quite on climate change, that we can approach issues horizontally and in a multi-stage manner. But for cities specifically, although when you look at relative EU emissions, in cities, local emissions coming from construction equipment can be relevant, as cities such as Oslo have shown in their climate strategy. And then the issue also comes from the share of emissions that arise from construction stages. Now, the European building stock is set to expand, and embodied emissions coming from construction stage are the second largest source of embodied emissions, accounting, for instance, between 10 and 70% of the emissions of a building. Emissions coming from construction is still relevant, and 90% of these emissions at the construction site come from the fuel combustion of fossil fuels.
So the environmental impact is pretty clear from what you just said. A lot of emissions that could be avoided. What type of health impact and urban impacts are cities dealing with diesel-powered machinery, and how can that also be impacted by utilizing zero-emission construction sites?
Yes, that's a good question, because I think possibly that's the primary source of concerns for cities specifically, because construction equipment is a major source of nitrogen oxide emissions, fine particulate matter, as well as carbon monoxide. And the public health impact is substantial. I think it was in 2023 that the European Environment Agency has estimated that around 180,000 people have died just because of fine particulate matter. And the year before, it was over 200,000 people. Now, in cities, in the EU specifically, about 95% of residents is exposed to harmful level of air pollutants. On top of that, construction equipment is also a major source of noise pollution, which I didn't know that before, but it's also lethal. The European Environment Agency has estimated that in 2023, around 40,000 people have died because of noise pollution. People exposed to environmental pollutions of this sort, both noise and air pollution, are at higher risk of developing cancers, heart diseases, depression, even diabetes type 2, apparently. That was also quite a surprise to me. So yes, cities should care quite a bit about that because they are in charge of drawing our air pollution roadmap that are foreseen by European regulation. And by 2030, the air pollution limits will be particularly stringent. We are, like recently, the European Commission has published a midterm review on the progress concerning the zero pollution action plan. And we are nowhere to meet the targets, nor for noise pollution, nor for air pollutants.
Wow, that's scary stats you shared. And it also just highlights the importance of looking at climate policies holistically and the co-benefits that are involved when health and just livelihood impacts of implementing kind of the green transition. So let's talk about Oslo, because that's the case study that you have studied and reported on. Oslo set a goal to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 95% by 2030 and identified construction and off-road machinery as priority sectors. And Oslo is also often cited as a global pioneer in zero-emission construction. What set the city on this path?
I would say that it was the Paris Agreement. The city had the interests and political will on contributing to the emission reduction efforts of Norway, and they developed a strategy to identify how to do it effectively. So, in this strategy, they outlined 16 priority areas for climate action, and building and construction fall within them. So, yes, I would say Paris Agreement, political will, but also it's important to emphasize that the city has set up the Oslo Climate Agency, which is an organization where very skilled municipal workers operate. They bring knowledge and administrative capacity, and that made feasible for the city to achieve very high climate targets.
And what role did public procurement play in pushing the market towards electric construction equipment? Since Oslo used procurement to create the demand signals, what could you share about that?
Now, if the city had realized that much of the leverage they could play was on indeed leveraging their public demand capacity, in 2019, they decided to revise the procurement strategy of the city to abandon lowest price criteria only. So they decided that they couldn't award bids based on lowest price only, but they, let's say, they opted for giving some weight to environmental and quality criteria. For instance, take a tender and you will submit and provide your services. The city had decided to award price a 30% weight and a similar weight to environmental criteria, including construction processes, environmental performance of materials used, biodiversity protections, and a 40% approximately was awarded to quality. So public procurement, by shifting away from lowest price, was used to stimulate innovation. I think this is an important point because the city had used public procurement to virtually create zero emission construction equipment from anew. It wasn't something that was there, but it was something that was requested. And because there were important developments happening in the transport sector, especially in heavy duty transport, I believe that the point was to show that was feasible also for off-road equipment, for instance. Yeah.
That's really interesting, especially about not focusing on the cost, because these are new technologies that are being implemented. And if it's a price sensitive procurement, it's really hard to promote these innovations. So yeah, thanks for sharing that. So there's a specific pilot you studied, Olav v Gate pilot project, the first fully zero emission construction site. What can you tell us about it?
Yes. Well, I think that this pilot had shown how quickly we could promote innovation through public demand when it is consistent and when it has clear and defined targets. The Olav Fifth Gate pilot project was preceded by extensive market dialogues with contractors, suppliers, energy providers, even civil society organizations, and by a set of pilots that were intended to progressively phase in zero emission equipment in construction sites, test their feasibility, their energy demand, just to lead all the way to a fully zero emission construction site. Now, what is impressive here is that the discussions on the use of zero emission construction equipment began somewhere in 2016, and the market dialogues occurred between 2017 and 2018. We could see a first fully operational zero emission construction site just 3 years later.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. And what did Oslo learn from this first pilot?
I think that Oslo had learned that it was key to engage early a wide set of stakeholders. The point, as I mentioned, it was involving suppliers to test the feasibility of procurement requirements, but also contractors that helped co-design construction plans, identify areas of operational risks. The city had also learned that early planning, both construction site planning and energy systems planning, allows to provide, to some extent, flexibility services to the grid, that it could promote the proposal of innovative solutions, such as mobile battery storage solutions on site. It provided us substantial knowledge on the logistic dimension of that. I would say that another aspect that was learned throughout the deployment of pilots was the benefits that this had on workers' health and working conditions on site. As I mentioned, the construction sites are very noisy, and the diesel exhaust fumes, like workers are consistently exposed to diesel exhaust emissions. Now, the construction workers could experience on firsthand how they could better breathe on a construction site and how the reduced noise emissions were impacting their daily life. I want to just note another statistic. I just want to emphasize that construction workers generally display a 40% higher risk of developing lung cancer because of diesel exhaust emissions, and the 25% higher risk of hearing loss. Now, this changes quite a lot with zero emission construction sites.
And again, to tie it to the health impacts is so key. And so your report was from Oslo to Europe. And so which other cities in Europe are you seeing following Oslo's example? And your reports, of course, help also to hopefully convince cities to follow in their footsteps. Which cities are you also seeing leading on this?
In the Netherlands, there are quite a few cities. The lead had been taken by the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management. So I would say it's quite state-led. And they promoted a national roadmap for zero emission construction sites that foresees the gradual phasing in public procurement of construction equipment in different power ranges, and they promoted a voluntary agreement that they promoted. It's important to emphasize that you have more than 150 parties that co-signed and that have committed to this national roadmap that foresees the full phase out of diesel power construction equipment by 2040. And these 150 parties are state agencies as well as the local authorities, but also the private sector. Then you have many pilot projects taking place in Paris, in Barcelona, in Vienna also. In Switzerland, they are piloting projects in Zurich, Basel, and Lausanne. And interestingly, in London, they've established what is called like a non-road mobile machinery low emission zone. This is not something that I've seen elsewhere in Europe. However, by 2040, they will not allow the diesel power construction equipment to be used within these low emission zones in London. These are just those that come to mind now, but there are more. I've been doing a mapping exercise, and yes, indeed, in the Nordics, you have so many more cities like Stockholm. Copenhagen has recently introduced a regulation for which by 2027, they will allow only construction equipment below 8 tons to operate, like zero emission construction. They've recently introduced a regulation for which starting mid 2027, only zero emission construction equipment for equipment that is below 8 tons will be allowed to operate in municipal construction sites. But then you have also Helsinki, and in the Nordics in particular, there are many other national voluntary agreements that cities can join, and they're increasingly joining these agreements.
That's so exciting to hear about this momentum. I noticed though Germany was not mentioned, so we have to work on that. So, there's momentum, but there's also barriers. So what are the biggest barriers you see to scaling zero-emission construction sites today?
It's what I hear quite often is that demand is still, although it's growing, it's still scattered and inconsistent and to some extent hard to plan. When we talk to suppliers, what they told us is that their off-takers, their buyers, are not confident yet enough to buy zero-emission construction equipment because they're afraid that municipal requirements will take long to go beyond the pilot stage. So I think the lack of consistent demand that would allow the production of this equipment at scale is a key barrier. It's important to mention that this equipment does cost more. We can see premiums that range, purchasing costs at least, premiums can range from 0 to 200%, depending on the size of the equipment, let's say. However, it's also true that these premiums are somewhat artificial, meaning that they are driven by the fact that there is no production at scale. There's no economies of scale in place. So if demand is set to increase, these premiums would decrease as well. One other thing that I want to highlight is that although purchasing costs are high, the total cost of ownership, so the purchasing costs plus the operating cost over the lifespan of the machinery, have better forecasts. In some cases, they are already positive. They show that this is a sound investment because efficiency gains, lower maintenance costs, and possibly lower energy costs in some area, they're all playing on the side of zero-emission construction equipment.
And what would it take for ZECS to become the norm across Europe?
I think European regulation is key, as well as increased demand, but also awareness. I feel like we don't really discuss the benefits of ZECS because we don't see them spread across Europe. But if you go to a resident of Oslo or of Eindhoven or of Amsterdam, they will tell you, yeah, this is amazing because I'm not bothered by the noise. I can easily breathe when I pass by a construction site. So it's interesting how often in climate action, the benefits are either invisible or they materialize over long time frames. While with zero emission construction sites, the benefits are very tangible from the outset, I would say. I think to have more awareness and that is critical, but we need also policy. Although Europe has important targets, climate targets and zero pollution targets, they are the policies that are in place, they fail short of including the impacts coming from diesel-powered non-road mobile machinery. And there is little guidelines on how to integrate them in city planning, for instance, in construction. Now, I want to highlight how currently policy in Europe is favoring artificially conventional and polluting solutions. There are measures such as the European Trading Scheme 2 that was set to price emissions from fossil fuel combustion has been postponed to 2028. And the Energy Taxation Directive that allows member states to award the preferential tax treatment to the combustion of diesel. Now, they are basically favoring polluting technologies and discouraging the use of cleaner ones. So this needs to be changed.
Yeah, that definitely sounds like a barrier. For Climatic Group, we are very focused on helping the startup ecosystem. And of course, with zero emission construction sites, the first thing I thought is how can startups get involved? So where do you see are the biggest opportunities for startups in ZECS?
Digitalization would be key. Zero emission construction sites create the opportunity for companies, but also for municipalities to gather data, to monitor construction sites. Providing services in this area would support cities substantially. Battery storage and swapping, creating a gas station model, but for electric construction equipment would be key to overcome some of the technical barriers that are presenting to cities. Providing consultancies on the logistic of construction sites, but also on professionalizing workers with the use of new equipment would help substantially. And services for energy optimization. I think it's difficult to disentangle all the services because they all come together. Finding ways to reduce consumption for smart load management, to allow cities to better integrate and scale up the use of zero emission construction sites locally. Finally, I think it's also important to support, to reimagine, let's say, traditional business models. So for resellers to move towards electric equipment, or for you maybe to open up a business that sells only electric equipment, when would that be feasible? But also rental companies, especially in these early stages. Contractors often don't purchase the equipment, but they rent it. And now, if demand from municipalities is set to move towards, let's say, electric equipment, it would be quite difficult for contractors to find the equipment nearby. They would need to request it from other areas in Europe where zero emission construction sites are more mature. And yeah, smart leasing, but I would say that consultancy services are really important still at this stage.
Lots and lots of great innovative solutions that can support this. We do get a lot of startups listening to our podcast. What's the best way for them to engage with cities working on ZECS?
So I would suggest for them to talk to procurers directly. And we're talking about those that draft the specifications in the public tenders, to request market dialogues with them, to engage with them early, show that there are solutions for them to address air pollution issues in their cities, noise pollution issues in their cities, to improve workers' working conditions at construction sites. I would suggest for you to go as a coalition, because cities are interested and want to support local business ecosystems. And if you go in as a coalition of startups that are showing the public benefits, the public good that they can bring to cities. I think this would level quite a lot the playing field for you. I would suggest also for startups to invite city officials at their event and to discuss, to show them what are the solutions that you have in mind and how this can be integrated in public tenders and run communication campaigns. Because as I said, there is still little knowledge on the benefits of zero emission construction equipment. So it's important to inform the general public so that they can be your allies, let's say, in this quest on moving towards cleaner solutions.
I love that you said that, because Climatic Group is partnering with Bologna to do just that in Berlin. We're planning to host an event in May with the city and some solution providers and industry that are working on this problem. So if we fast forward 10 years, what does a typical construction site in Europe look like? The construction site of the future.
I've been thinking quite a bit about this question, and when you work on this topic, it can be a bit frustrating to see that it gets downplayed, let's say, often. But we really do live in uncertain times. It's difficult to predict anything, but we know a few things. First and foremost is that batteries are quite a technology of the future. Their costs are coming down. There's massive investment from Europe on developing battery production capacity. We know that performance of battery is increasing. So at least on that end, the trajectory is clear. It also means that probably in the coming years, the cost of construction equipment will decrease substantially. Then Europe is betting on electrification for many industrial sectors, and it's investing substantially in strengthening its grid and to favor the use of renewables. We have climate and pollution targets that need to be supported by sounder market demand signals. It's true, but the trajectory also there, it's clear in my opinion. I thought a bit whether or not saying this last thing, because it's quite unfortunate and I don't really enjoy, let's say, sometimes using these unfortunate events to make the case for climate action. But it's important to mention that we are in the midst of a war. Energy prices are increasing, and we will never have the capacity to produce fossil fuels. We will always be dependent on that. So the future needs to be renewable. Now, given that, I expect in 10 years to be able to walk in streets, and in Brussels, there are construction sites almost everywhere. And every time you'll pass by one, you will, in 10 years, I think that I will be able to pass by a construction site without holding my breath, without the need to shut down the call and tell my mom that I will call her later. And that, yes, that we will all benefit from cleaner air in cities. So yeah, I think zero emission construction sites will be maybe not the norm, but we will have way more zero emission construction equipment running in our cities.
I love that vision for the future. Thank you so much, Linda. This was a very interesting conversation. And I really like how you talked about how cities use policy, procurement, and partnerships to bring those technologies into the real world. For our listeners, thank you for tuning in to Climatic Scale. You can find our other episodes on climaticgroup.substack.com, our website, on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. I will also share these 2 reports that Linda co-authored, as well as part of our communications push for this episode. Thank you again, Linda.
Thank you.
We scale.